Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. What happens if a president is unable, physically or mentally, to perform the duties of the office? Can he or she be temporarily sidelined or removed from office entirely? Who could determine that a president is so seriously impaired that such drastic steps need to be taken? Has anything like that happened before? We'll talk about this with my guest, an expert on such matters. John Feerick is a professor and former dean at Fordham Law School, and he was one of the authors of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which provides the guidelines for presidential succession in cases of death, illness, mental impairment, impeachment, resignation, or other matters that might arise. Dean Feerick, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming in. I appreciate it. The possibility that a president could become incapacitated and not perform the duties of his or her office occurred to the framers of the Constitution, but they weren't particularly clear about what should be done. Is that right?
That's correct. You have Article 2 of the Constitution, Section 1, Clause 6, is the succession provision. And it provides for a case of death, resignation, removal, disability of a president and vice president, and allows for Congress to have a power to set up a line of succession. So there was a contemplation that those kind of contingencies might occur in American history.
How did they approach the issue, though? If I understand it correctly, it was not even clear, let's say a president died in office, it was not even clear whether the vice president would be an acting president or a president. What did they anticipate? Do you have a sense of that?
Yes and no. At the Constitutional Convention, Dickinson, one of the framers of the Constitution, asked the question, what do we mean by disability, and who has the power to declare a disability? And those questions weren't answered at the Constitutional Convention. So convention ended with the proposed Constitution being ratified, and then Congress adopted a succession law to deal with a line of succession of two people, as the President Pro Tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House. And until 1841, we didn't have to deal with, in our history, an event that would invoke that provision. And when President Harrison died in office in 1841, his vice president asserted that in the case of death of a president, the vice president becomes president for the rest of the term.
So this was William Henry Harrison.
Correct.
And the vice president was John Tyler?
Correct. And so he took the position, Tyler took the position that in the event of a death of a president, he became the president. Others didn't agree with that. They said, no, the succession provision meant that you remain as vice president, but you are the acting president. And that was what was intended by the framers of the Constitution. So you had a debate on that in the Congress at the time, but ultimately, because of how forceful he was about asserting that there is a vacancy, it's going to remain a vacancy if not filled for the rest of the term of Harrison, and he became in name the President of the United States. Others had a different view of that.
So John Tyler carried the day. He determined that he would be president,
that's right,
not acting president, and that's sort of what happened.
That became the precedent.
So this year marks the 50th anniversary, which is kind of incredible because we're talking about 1967, the 50th anniversary of the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, of which you were one of the authors. Tell us what the 25th Amendment does and why it was necessary.
Right. I had a role participating in the process along with others. outside of Congress, in the American Bar Association. American Bar Association took a particular interest in the subject at the time of President Kennedy's assassination. And
President Kennedy was killed in 1963, in November of 1963.
Correct. And I had done a study prior to the assassination, and I was invited to participate with 11 other people assembled by the American Bar Association to take a look at the very issue of what would happen if Kennedy had not died and he was disabled. How
Right.
would we have dealt with that contingency? And some of your former colleagues, New York Times wrote articles that weekend, Arthur Kroc, James Reston, focusing on that kind of issue. The American Bar Association brought 12 of us together in the end of January of '64. Senator Birchby participated in those discussions. He was a young senator that was chairing the Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments. And what we focused on was two problems. One was filling a vacancy in the vice presidency. When Kennedy died, Johnson became president following the Tyler precedent and leaving a vacancy in the vice presidency because there was no way to deal with that. And
So if a vice president became president, there then was no vice president
no
of the
vice
United
president.
States.
And then you ran into the line of succession. That's the statutory line of succession. At that time, the line went from the Speaker to the President pro tem, and then the members of the cabinet. The first succession law had the reverse, had the President pro tem first, and then the Speaker, and no one else. So we focused collectively, all those participated in the reform movement at the time, on filling a vacancy in the vice presidency that would minimize resort to the line of succession. Because line of succession only takes over if you don't have a president and vice president.
Right.
And so that was a major part of our discussion. And the other part was, had Kennedy been in a coma and obviously unable to declare his disability, how would we go about handling that? And I think what would have happened at the time, because of a letter agreement that Kennedy had worked out with Vice President Johnson, was that the Vice President would have declared that he was now the acting president because the president was disabled. He would have, the letter agreement, the protocol that had been set up by Kennedy and Johnson would contemplate the use of well, not the amendment, because there was no amendment at that point.
There was no amendment at the time.
That's how the succession provision ought to work.
So there was an agreement between Kennedy and
Right.
Johnson.
Yes.
And then, just as there had been an agreement, I think, between Eisenhower and Richard Nixon.
Correct.
That in such a circumstance, the vice president could declare that the president was disabled. But this was an agreement in a letter and didn't have the force of law.
Correct.
Now, my question is, you were interested and had in fact written an article about this very topic just a short time before President Kennedy was assassinated. So why was this issue on your mind at that time?
It has to do with my education, I would say. When I was at Fordham College, I was a political science major, and I came to read the Constitution, took a course in constitutional law. I became fascinated by the Constitution, and I wrote papers on the Constitution when I was at Fordham College. At Fordham Law School, I continued that interest, having an opportunity as a member of the Fordham Law Review at the time. I wrote 3 different publications for the Fordham Law Review, and I focused on the Constitution. So when I was graduating from law school, I wanted to continue my writing and in the area of the Constitution, someplace, somewhere. And my best recollection is that I read an article, I think it might have been in the New York Law Journal, not positive of that, on the problem of disability. And almost at the same time, I had a classmate had all these clippings from Eisenhower's years about his disabilities.
Eisenhower had 2 heart attacks and also a stroke.
Correct. And I remember saying to myself, why is this a problem? And so I didn't spend the next, I guess you could say, 2 years looking into the problem. I went in the Army for 6 months during that period, but I had loads of articles and material with me to read everything that had been written on the subject. learn more about the debates in Congress that had preceded the letter agreements, and even during the period of the letter agreements, and then put it together in an article.
Right. And then, of course, it was just so timely, tragically timely, because just a short while later, Kennedy was killed. So anyway, so the 25th Amendment passes, takes effect in 1967.
Correct.
And so this is supposed to spell out what happens in almost every case of where there's a need for presidential succession. So my question is, Donald Trump's behavior has been unusual, to say the least. And a lot of people think that some of his behavior is problematic. You and I are not in any position to make any kind of determination on that. But my question is, what happens if you have a president and then someone who is close to that president or interacts with that president every day comes to be really concerned that the president is disabled in some way or not up to the task of performing his or her duties? If that occurs, what's the first step? Who can initiate some kind of a process?
Let's sort of move back a little bit. There are two sections in the 25th Amendment that provide greater clarification. Don't answer all the questions, provide greater clarification than we've ever had in our history. The first section says that a president can declare his own disability, right, and pass over powers and duties to the vice president, who becomes the acting president, still remaining as the vice president. So this
is with the agreement of the president.
It's just the president himself.
President declares
himself disabled.
I'm disabled for whatever reason.
Right, and then he can resume his powers and duties when he believes he's ready to resume his powers and duties. Now, Section 4 deals with a more difficult problem. The problem is, what if the president can't make or communicate a decision as to his competency to perform the powers and duties of his office? His plane went down, right, and you can't find the president, or he's kidnapped. And you know he's kidnapped, but he can't obviously perform powers and duties of office, or he's in a coma, right, or he may be temporarily disabled for other reasons. How do we deal with that? So Section 4 of the amendment says that the vice president and majority of the cabinet have the power to declare that there's a circumstance of inability that requires the vice president to become the acting president until that circumstance disappears and the president's able to resume his powers and duties again.
What if the vice president and, let's say, the majority of the cabinet decides the president is disabled, the president is acting in a bizarre fashion, and they come to this determination, but the president doesn't agree? What happens then?
And that obviously is an extremely difficult crisis point, really. The whole country is going to be enveloped in that kind of issue, in my view. And what it says that Congress has 21 days to resolve that disagreement. And during the interim period, during the 21 days, the vice president continues to act as the president. Now, as soon as the cabinet and majority say, we believe you're disabled, and the vice president becoming the acting president, if you have a disagreement on that, they have 4 days. They have 4 days, so to speak, to decide. Is the president able to resume? If he doesn't, the vice president continues. But Congress has 21 days to make a decision on that issue.
So when there's a dispute, ultimately it's up to Congress to decide, right, and then in both houses of Congress?
Both houses, and it requires a 2/3 vote of both houses to prevent the president from resuming his powers and duties. So it's a very high threshold that has to be met before you can sideline, if I can use that expression, the president on a continued basis. And part of that high threshold is out of respect for the office of president and the fact that we would have had an elected president with a 4-year term fixed for that president in the Constitution. So that's essentially how the compromise occurred, some of the reasons for it.
So both before and after the 25th Amendment, there have been a surprising number of cases where there's been, where a presidential succession occurred, or there was a need for some form of succession or intervention, or in some cases, no succession occurred, but perhaps there should have been. I'm thinking, for example, about Woodrow Wilson. Can you talk a little bit about what went on with President Wilson?
Sure. We had, before this 25th Amendment, 8 times when presidents died in office, and 4 cases of assassination. But in terms of, and then we've had major cases of disability. Woodrow Wilson, as you point out, is one of those. He had a stroke, and for 17 plus months he appears to have been disabled from fully discharging the powers and duties of office. And government was, in a sense, you could say the government of the executive was to some extent impacted by that. He was not able to participate in the effort to have a League of Nations. Others tried to carry on for the president, including his spouse, including his doctor and friends. Right. And it was a clear case, in my judgment, of disability from all the information that's come down to the present. But you had these uncertainties present at the time. One was, in a case of a disability, does the vice president become president for the rest of the term, or is he just an acting president for the duration of the
right.
disability? That question created a hesitancy on the part of Vice President Marshall, Wilson's vice president. And also the cabinet had the issue of, do we have a power, do we have a role, or is it for the vice president? And the vice president is not going to take on that kind of role. At least history has indicated during the Wilson years and during the Garfield years, some decades before, vice presidents were reluctant without clarification on their status in the right. inability process to act when the facts seem to suggest we needed an acting president.
And I think they would still be reluctant to act even post 25th Amendment, but without any kind of law to govern the situation. Who was going to declare that President Wilson was unfit to carry, right. to go ahead?
But let me take your statement after the 25th Amendment. After the 25th Amendment, we have a 25th Amendment that speaks about the disability of a president, and if a president such as Wilson were not able to perform the powers and duties of the office, my sense is that the media in the country, having a constitutional amendment there, would insist that the vice president should become the acting president, and maybe the president would cooperate and just pass over his powers and duties, as President Bush did, and as President Reagan once did, to the vice president to be the acting president until he recovered.
Now, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, and here's something that I found peculiar, because this was post-25th Amendment. So President Reagan is shot, but the 25th Amendment was not invoked at that time?
Correct.
Why not?
I guess there was a lot of confusion about the precedent, the protocols at the time. I heard different stories. Fred Fielding was counsel to the president, had started working on protocols that would deal with contingencies, perhaps such as the Reagan contingency, but really hadn't played out in any formal way, discussions with the cabinet. So, and Reagan was operated on pretty quickly, and it was some, when he came through, recovered slightly, he was able to have a communication with his chief of staff and press person. And Bush, in the meantime, is somewhere else, in Bush Sr. in the country, really out of
he was not in Washington.
not in Washington, out of effective communication with the White House, and that was I think that was a factor. And when he got back that evening, according to the history we have, President was slightly better. Was he recovered and fully able? I don't think so. But they decided that that he was going to get better, and they didn't want him to be the first president in history to be considered disabled. And also, I think we have some history that Baker, who supported Bush to be the president, was chief of staff, was somewhat reluctant about encouraging the use of the amendment.
This is Howard Baker.
James Baker.
No, I'm sorry, James Baker.
James Baker. Yeah. So that's what I read in the histories. It should. I think Senator Birch Bayh and others feel it should have been used on that occasion to give Reagan rather the opportunity to fully recover without the stress of having to discharge the powers and duties of the office by allowing the vice president to be the acting president. But it continues to be a debate on that question.
So developing and getting the 25th Amendment passed, as you have pointed out, took a tremendous amount of cooperation and in many cases bipartisan cooperation. Talk about how, we don't have a lot of time left, but talk about how smoothly that went, and then sort of project to present day where there's the parties just seem to be really at odds. There's a high level of partisanship, and whether you think the 25th Amendment could even be passed nowadays.
On the first question, it was extraordinary. There was extraordinary feelings by President Johnson of fulfilling Kennedy's mandate. The leaders of Congress, Everett Dirksen, minority leader, and Mike Mansfield, the majority leader, were working together on getting things done that needed to be done. Similar leadership in John McCormick in the House of Representatives. Everybody came together. Significant people came together, including Eisenhower, who supported the amendment. He
was an ex-president at the time.
And he was very supportive of it. It was a wonderful time to see our Congress functioning in the best interest of the American people. And I was a young lawyer. I saw it, and it fulfilled all the ideals I had as a college student at Fordham of how government should work. Now, in terms of the present moment, I'm very upset, and all of those around me are very upset that we're a nation that's divided, and that's not good when there's such division in the country. So I keep hoping and praying that the divided country will come together more in the greater interest of the young people. I have grandchildren, I have children, and whether it could pass, your question, whether it could pass in the present moment, I haven't seen enough to see anything right now getting passed.
We're going to have to end it there. I want to thank you for coming in, Professor John Feerick, Fordham Law School. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. James H. Jackson traveled by bus from Baltimore to New York City looking for black men to kill. It didn't take him long to find Timothy Kaufman, a 66-year-old black man who was sifting through trash for empty bottles and cans. Jackson, who told authorities he despises blacks, pulled out a sword with an 18-inch blade and plunged it into Kaufman's chest with such force that the blade emerged from the victim's back. A witness heard Kaufman cry out, "What are you doing?" He died a few minutes later after making his way to a nearby police station. As the New York Times reported, cities across America have been experiencing a tragic rise in crimes motivated by racial, ethnic, and religious hatred, since last November's presidential election. In February, 2 men from India were shot in a bar in Kansas by a man who questioned their immigration status. One of the victims, a 32-year-old software engineer, was killed. A young white man who ran to the aid of the shooting victims was also shot and wounded. According to the Anti-Defamation League, white supremacists, emboldened by the current political climate, are engaged in unprecedented outreach efforts on American college campuses. What kind of country are we becoming? Where is this madness taking us? What will we be like 5 or 10 years from now if the haters are allowed to continue spreading their poison unchecked? We all need to fight back. This is not their country, the haters' country. This is our country. Write letters, tweet, use your social media tools, protest, and demonstrate. Do everything you can to let all and sundry know, especially our political leaders, that this is not the America we want. This is not an America we will ever accept. That's all for now. See you next time.